Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our latest webinar session on subcontractor management in OpenAir. My name is Ron Bro, President CEO, and I'm happy to present this today. So today's agenda, we'll talk about subcontractors. What kind of access do we typically see with our customers? How do we track? How do we use profiles and subcontracting? What's the benefit there? We will also talk about capturing time as well as capturing costs for contractors for reporting and for profitability purposes. What type of information do we see, information do we share with contractors through dashboards and reports? And then what kind of internal reports are we seeing from customers to keep track of contractors and what kind of work they're doing and how they're impacting our projects? So we will talk about all these things and a few other items. So when we talk about subcontracting management, what does that concept really mean, right? So as part of a professional service organization, most of them use a subcontractor to fill gaps in when maybe their employees are all busy or they're bringing in a skill set that they don't have internally. So there's always the challenge of how to work with contractors inside of your PSA system. And some of the challenges include, how do we cost some contractors? So some might be hourly, some might be fixed fee, some may have a very special skill set, so there's always that challenge. Understanding availability is always a trick, unless you're working with that contractor, you may not have access to calendars. Knowing, what their skill set or profile is as you're doing searches, although they may not be working for you at the moment. So that's good information to have. And then, how do you balance OpenAir licensing versus the use of contractors? So we'll talk about a few tips and tricks we see with customers. And then obviously, everyone wants to make sure that, if you have a non-employee logging in or access to OpenAir, making sure that they're very limited as to what they can see or do. So we'll talk a little bit about roles and filter sets. So basically there are two different approaches we see with subcontractor usage. One is, we brought in a subcontractor, we're going to set him up with a user license, and he's going to basically enter time and behave the same as our employees. So set him up, they'll give access to projects and tasks, and then they'll enter time at the same cadence as your employees. So that's a pretty typical when you have a small amount of contractors, or if you have contractors that are critical to the execution of projects, and you want to be able to manage them just like you do any other employee record. Another situation we've seen is where maybe you've hired a company to provide you with a number of folks, and you don't want all these different disparate folks logging in and entering time and having to pay for licenses. Maybe they're seasonal or temporary for a particular time period. And so in that scenario, we see where, maybe you just set up one user account for that particular vendor, and then have the vendor or have someone enter on behalf of the vendor the time and or expenses for that one license. You can use the notes feature to enter in, which of the contractors did the work. So you have some individual visibility there, and then you're only paying for one license versus multiple, and still being able to bill that time and also capture those costs to your projects. You can use both approaches. If you have some subcontractors that you treat like employees and manage them, then you can use a user account. And if you have the other scenario where you have multiple being provided by one or many vendors, then you can have that set up as well and have a combination of approaches here. You just have to understand, what are the pros and cons of each approach, right? So, an individual approach, you're going to have much more visibility to be able to see hours and more transparent to who's working on which projects and doing what hours versus a general vendor user, you'll have less availability, less visibility as to the work they're doing. So you just have to kind of balance, which approach makes the most sense for your scenario. In any way you do it, it's always a good idea to tag your users as a vendor, because there's many types of reports you'll want to either focus on these users or exclude these users from different, like maybe utilization reports. So, the simplest way to do this is just to create a custom field that gives a user type on a user record and be able to set, is this a full-time employee, part-time employee, or a contractor, and then be able to use that field for reporting and filtering throughout the system. More common what we see is using a feature of entity tags. Entity tags, think of a custom field with a start and end date. And so being able to track like employment status, for example. So for this period of time, I was an employee, and then maybe I transitioned to a contractor or vice versa. We have a lot of scenarios where you'll hire someone as a contractor and then bring them in as an employee after a period of time. And so rather than having to set up multiple users for the same person, you can use these entity tag groups to transition folks from one employment status to another. And that gives you a lot of reportability to be able to exclude the time they were a contractor for, say, your utilization reports, and include the time they're an employee and within the date parameters. So entity tags are really good. You can also do searches for entity tags now. We'll talk about that later in the presentation. But definitely recommend trying to use entity tags. They can be very helpful for a lot of reasons. So everyone's worried about limiting access for contractors. Generally, we see that role is a very limited role, right? They may only be able to log in and enter time and expenses, and they only see the time and expense module, say. We have some contractors that actually are hired as project managers, so they have more permissions, but not quite as many as our full-time project managers. So you'll have to craft your roles to suit your situation, as well as your filter set. If you want to limit the contractor to only seeing their selves inside of the different modules, or their projects if they're behaving as a PM only. So we want to limit what data they can access inside of the roles, as well as the filter sets. One word of caution, I don't know if you noticed this, but a lot of times when you create a new user, and you'll get an auto add assignment group, and a lot of customers will have a all employee assignment group that everyone may get auto added to when you create. You may want to make sure when you're creating contractors that you are not, that you're removing them from any assignment groups they get auto added to. This will limit their being able to enter PTO hours or see the PTO projects or admin projects on their timesheet. So just a word of caution there if you are using any auto add assignment group, make sure you pay attention to those. We're seeing a lot of customers with interest in tracking skills and building out those skill profiles in OpenAir. And there's subcontractors can participate, and it's recommended they do participate. And for a lot of reasons, a lot of times when you're searching for skills, you may want to expand your search to include subcontractors, or to include inactive users. So if you've had contractors in the past with certain skill sets do work for you, maybe you want to pull those up as a search. Maybe you want to go find out if those subcontractors are available to work for you again. And so you can now search for inactive. You can search by entity tag as well. So being able to say, search for subcontractors in particular as well. And you can also now search by hourly cost. So we'll talk about how to manage costs for contractors, but you can actually go in there and search cost to pull up both contractors and other users through a cost search. That's new as of the release in 2019. So this talks about the searching for inactive. You can see here on the left screenshot, you have the resource type filter, which gives you generic and inactive users that you can determine what the scopes. And then on the right, entity tags, being able to select the effective rate of an entity tag. So being able to, that was really helpful when searching for, particularly if you're searching for a contractor, maybe would be very good use of those tags. As you're managing the cost of contractors, there's a lot of challenges we run across there, right? So, you know, my contractor sends an invoice. I'm not a T&M shop, but I want to get the cost applied to my project so that I can derive, profitability and margin. So, there's a couple of different approaches we've seen. You could actually have someone go in and create an expense report against that project. You could have an expense item for subcontractor costs, and go in and create that expense report against that project for the amount of cost for that invoice period, vendor invoice period. So that's one way to get that in. You can actually use approval processes for those to have project managers approve those costs against their project. Also in OpenAir, there's a purchase module. And within the purchase module, you can create purchase requests. If you're looking to request some subcontractors, you can create vendor POs. So if your contractor is giving you an all-in number for the work they're going to do, and then as you receive invoices each month and you fulfill those POs, you're then fulfilling costs each month against that project for reporting purposes. And so the purchasing module also, is a typical module we see syncing with financial systems. So if you run a financial system where you're issuing vendor bills and vendor payments, that's a place where you would likely want to integrate between OpenAir and that financial system to bring in those costs into your system. If you are doing a lot of time and material billing, and your contractors are providing time, either entering it directly, or if they're entering it through a proxy, obviously you can assign costs to the user record and have that cost apply to all those hours entered. However, we'll talk about in a minute, how to make sure you're getting the correct cost. And we have customers that have all three approaches deployed, where they'll have some subcontractors that are providing hours, some contractors that are coming in as fixed fee, and they need a combination of these approaches to be able to get in the right costs into the system. One thing to note, if you are entering time and bringing in purchase items or expense reports, make sure you're not double costing your projects and you're excluding one cost or the other, because you don't want to double cost your project and skew your margins. So when they're entering time directly, generally it's controlled by a task assignment or a booking, similar to you would employees. You can actually, if you have late timesheets alerts, which probably most users do, you want to make sure you can control those, who those go to, because contractors may not enter time every week. They may enter time one week and skip a week and then enter time the next week. So you want to control those alerts. And also there's a feature that I'll walk through in the system of how to reconcile time entries from vendor invoices that is really helpful for us, for most customers. So we'll talk about that, and I'll actually demo that in OpenAir real quick. If you're looking to control timesheet alerts, there's a few tricks that we've used. There's a timesheet required setting on all users. And then you can filter your timesheet alerts by that setting. So that can be useful to say our subcontractors are not required users, but all our employees that are doing project work are. So it's a way to be able to include, exclude that your class of folks or types of folks. You could also use departments. That's a filter you can add here in this alert, and you can add all your contractors in a subcontractor department. So that's another way to to exclude. You could also use bookings or task assignments. So if you're booking your resources and they're not booked within a period, then maybe they don't get an alert because their timesheet's not due. So there's some options here. You just want to make sure you're sending the right alerts to the right folks at the right time. Cost override. So this is a common conversation we have around how do we track costs for contractors accurately. Obviously, OpenAir has costing at a user level for multiple cost levels if need be. So there's 3 costs that you can utilize. And if you sign an agreement with your contractor that they're going to bill you at 1 cost for all the work they do, then that's the way to go. But a lot of customers will negotiate on a contract by contract basis based on the type of work and the particular project. So in that scenario, you may have a cost that the subcontractor uses for 90% of the projects they work on, but then on this one project, they're going to give you a different cost that you want to track. So you can enable project cost override. It's a switch that allows you to basically override the cost of the user for a particular project. And so you can actually go down a level there. It's rarely seen, but occasionally you can actually go down to the task and put an override there. And so what the system will do is when you have these turned on, when the timesheet's being approved, the system will first look to the task to see if there's an override. Then it'll look to the project, see if there's an override there. And if those are both null, then it'll go to the user and pull whatever the hourly rate is there. So it's how the workflow works behind the scenes. And you can do cost override for all 3 costs. Primary, secondary, and tertiary can all be used in this process. So this is what I referred to earlier. This is a really a cool little feature that not a lot of customers are aware of. And the business case is, I got an invoice from my contractor who, said he worked 40 hours last week. And I want to go in and validate the hours on the timesheet to the hours he entered in OpenAir. So this is assuming that he's entering it or a proxy is entering in time for that contractor, and you're receiving an invoice for those same hours. And do they reconcile, or do I need to accrue costs in my financial system? So how do I make OpenAir help me do that? So this is one of those I'm going to jump into OpenAir and walk through that process. So let me pull up OpenAir real quick. So under the timesheet module, there's time entries link that allows you to basically see a very granular daily view of time entries across timesheets, across periods. You can, it's a great way to be able to quickly grab how much time was spent by a user or by project, by client, et cetera, filtering on approved hours, all hours, et cetera. So in this scenario, I'm looking at July of 2020, and I'm looking at Larry Nelson. He's my contractor, and I can see Larry submitted an invoice for the first half of July, and I went through and validated that those hours matched. And now I've got an invoice for the second half of July. And so now I'm going to go through and look at my invoice and say, okay, well, the 20th works, the 21st, 22nd, 23rd, but he entered 8 hours on the 24th, but he didn't invoice me for those. So I'm going to go ahead and mark these 4 entries as processed. And that way you can create a report, a contractor accrual report that basically will allow you to bring in any time entries within a period that have not been reconciled. So to reconcile these, I'll go through and grab the ones I'm good with, and then I can use bulk actions, and I can set my reconcile to paid, and I can put invoice 456. So these fields here are part of the setup on how to get this feature working. There's a couple of custom fields that you have to set up on the time entry. Let's see. And when you do that, it enables these fields reconciled and notes come through. And then you can then have this action shows up as well as part of this switch, and gives you this ability. So now what I can do is I can go in and I can say, okay, in July, show me any hours Larry entered that I haven't been invoiced for. And then so maybe I want to go and accrue, and I know the cost because I have the cost stored in the system. So now I can run a report that says and filtered by anything not reconciled, and I can see a dollar amount for Larry for July that I can then go and accrue for. So great little way to reconcile your contractor's time out in an invoice. Now, a lot of customers don't even ask their contractors to invoice them. They just pay based on the time entered and approved inside the system. So, and then you use the same feature that way, but I go in and go in here and run a report, show me all hours entered in the system that have yet to be reconciled for a period. I say, okay, they've got 32 hours. So now I'm going to go in and mark these as paid on a certain date. And then that way, the next payroll I do, I can pick up anything that was entered. Even if they go back and enter a timesheet in the previous period, I can pick those hours up because they weren't reconciled. So again, another way to use this feature with or without vendor invoices as part of the process. Okay. So some of the reports that we share with contractors is what schedules they have in the system. So again, building out those reports, building in filters in those reports so the contractor's only seeing them, and being able to share those reports out, and maybe put those in dashboards for your contractors. Also what history of time have they been entering, and against projects. So those are kind of two of the reports that we typically see that you'll want to share with contractors. You want to make sure that your filter sets are set appropriately within the reports or within the user setup to make sure they have, test to make sure they have the right valid view of the data. From a hirer of contractors, we're paying attention to these contractor schedules and forecasting our costs on these projects using contractors. You want to make sure you have the right balance of employees' participation and contractors. And so being able to, using the entity tags, we can report on that and make sure we're good. We also want to validate timesheet compliance for contractors. So again, validating when timesheets are expected, when they're not expected, and making sure we're getting those in on a timely basis. The reconciliation using the time entry feature is not necessarily a report, but it is a way, and you can generate reports there, as I mentioned, to be able to go in and apply those reconciliations. And then obviously running time entry and cost reports, factoring in your project profitability, your time entry by the type of user, making sure your costing is appropriate. So all of those are key metrics and KPIs that it's important to keep an eye on if you're using heavy subcontractors. So these are just some of the dashboards that we will see inside of the system. Planned and actual hours, obviously, vendor skill sets, revenue ratio, how much of your revenues being generated from a subcontractors versus employee. So that would be a good KPI to keep an eye on. Forecast versus employee versus subcontract as well. So that's another good one. Cost factor of a subcontractor versus employee. So those are just all really good metrics that we report on. We help our customers do so. So in summary, subcontractors are a critical wheel for a critical component of professional service organizations. So it's you want to make sure that you are set up to maximize the benefit, minimize the problems that sometimes or the challenges. So making sure you are managing the costs and getting accurate cost reporting. Make sure you have those metrics for reporting. Make sure you have, if you're using skill sets or profiles, being able to make sure your contractors are participating so that you have that good intel. And, as you're setting up your contractors as users, if you're going to give them access, make sure your OpenAir admin or whoever's responsible for setting up the users understand the onboarding process and making sure they're setting them up correctly so that you are able to benefit from all the reporting and the views and the entity tags and roles and filter sets. Okay, so thanks to everyone for today's presentation. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. And if there are any questions, I will be happy to answer any questions.